solve my own one. So, but okay, this is, welcome, just 5 minutes late. The Ottoman Empire and the Making of the Modern Middle East. It covers a big area. I have a few slides here, pictures here just for illustrations. Remember, we talked last time about the new Greece from the 1830s. It was the beginning of peeling away the parts of the empire. Here we have on the right side the Bulgarian king late in the 19th century. The Bulgarians felt that they were reviving their ancient Bulgarian empire. And then down here at the bottom, the tragedy of World War I, 4 different armies facing on the frontier. I'm going to review a little bit of what we did last time. Remember, in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is losing almost all of its European territories. And you can see on the map how it loses Romania, Bulgaria, Greece. We talked about Egypt, which is not on the map. And then you get this, for some people, in some people's eyes, the final blow, the loss of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, which we'll see is sort of in a way, a trigger of World War I. Even before it lost all its territories, we had what we called capitulations, which is external control of the different parts of the economy. And I gave you the example of it happens even now when you think of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, or the European Union trying to control the Greek economy. They're so deeply in debt that in order to avoid default, they allow external controls. And that's what was happening with the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. It's happening with Greece right now. And we'll see probably in lecture 3, I think Turkey's in danger of that happening again. But anyway, in the 19th century, you have something called the Tanzimat, which is a series of reforms in an attempt to make a modern country, secular law, equality of citizens, and so on. And I'm not going to go over the details of the Tanzimat, but there it was. 1908, young Turk officers say, look, this Sultan is really a loser. We've got to take over. And they have this revolution. It doesn't last very long. Sultan comes back in 1909, but they're ready for post-World War I. One of the things that happened is the end of what's called the millet system. Here's a quote: Muslim and non-Muslim, Turkish and Greek, Armenian and Jewish, Kurd and Arab. Before the end of the millet system, each of these had its own set of laws and its own internal controls. And that's not what we consider a modern state. A modern state, for good or bad, has all the citizens subject to one system. Well, 1911 and 12 and 13, what are called the Balkan Wars, the successor states down here on the map, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, start fighting over an area which is called Macedonia. Of course, last year I talked a lot more about Macedonia. Just for your information, we now have a country called North Macedonia, which is in a lot of dispute over a whole series of things now. And in World War I, those rivalries of the Balkan Wars continued. And in my own mind, to me, the World War I is a kind of third Balkan War. Even though, lots of books we read talk about France and Germany up here on the this front over here, but it started down here. And the war aims of these countries was to grab parts of the Ottoman Empire, and we'll see that. Lastly, I want to remind you that I mentioned Edward Said and his book Orientalism, where Westerners are so imbued with the imperialist notion that he would say, you probably shouldn't believe anything I say now. But he has made us aware of the imperialist tradition, even if it's sort of gone overboard. Okay, now what happens in the First Balkan War? Bulgaria, Serbia, Turkey, they're all fighting. It results in a humiliating defeat for the Ottomans, and they lose almost all their territory in Europe. And if you can think of the current map, this is what it used to be before World War I. Before the World War I. So you have this big Ottoman state that still had some territories here, and there's Bulgaria is smaller than we know it now. Serbia is smaller than what we know it now. Greece is smaller. And well, that's just another map of the same thing to try to get you oriented. Well, then comes World War I. And if you look at the countries in green, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, they're called the Central Powers, opposed to the Allies, who are United Kingdom, France. They bribe Italy to join the war. And one of the things Italy wants is some imperialist control in the Ottoman Empire. All right. The war breaks out, and both sides woo the Ottoman Empire, but the young Turks decide to go with Germany. And this is this sort of coat of arms, wonderfully ornate. And I give you a picture of this fabled city of Constantinople, now called Istanbul. And you got Enver Pasha, who's a war minister, and he says, all eligible men are to report for induction immediately. Well, this is not a modern state. They couldn't deal with all these people. At the same time, they started drafting men and pack animals, so the agriculture starts to disintegrate. So this country, at the beginning in 1915, is really falling apart centrally. Meanwhile, you have the great powers. Great Britain sees India as the jewel of its empire, and they're very concerned over the control of the Suez Canal. Russia wants to get through the straits through Istanbul. France wants to control Syria, and Austria-Hungary is afraid of all these Slavic nationalisms. And then this war breaks out. And here I give you a picture of Feldzugming's campaign in the field, 1914. I'm not sure, I think they're Austro-Hungarian soldiers, probably each one speaking a different language and having trouble communicating. Remember, we may think war in the 20th century is modern, but they're moving by horses. This is trying to give you an example of what the difficulty was of the warfare. They've got all these guns. How do you get them there? What do you do? And of course, later on, we read about the introduction of the airplane in the war, the Red Baron, if you will. I just think these are very colorful pictures. And to remind you, we are on the verge of the new technology. So we have a combination of the old, horse-drawn carriage has gone through the mud, and the new airplane. Well, the wartime Ottoman Empire, they join Germany and Austria-Hungary. So here we are. This is that map again. I keep showing you the maps because I have the feeling that in our country, we're not too good on the maps. So here's you would think it looks like a very powerful group of Central Powers and a very powerful group of Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. And as we'll see, we know about the Russian Revolution of 1917. That's a country that's not in good shape. Ottoman Empire had a revolution, a revolt in 1908, They beat it off, but they're still in trouble. Serbia, if you recall, is the place where the war starts. That's the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. So, and they get invaded at the beginning of the war. I'm not going to go into that. We're not going to have any details of battles. We don't really have time for it. But what are the war aims? The Germans, why are they involved with the Ottoman Empire? They're sort of late to the imperial game. If those of you who were here Tuesday, you saw Harry talk about the Boer War and the British attempt to control so much of Africa. At the same time, the French were controlling West Africa, or parts of it. And the Germans wanted to get in on the action. They had one or two colonies, but they're very much involved in the Ottoman Empire. They tried to build something called the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. And then they send a general, Liman von Sanders. This is a big deal that a German general runs the Turkish army. I mean, he's not just a guy like a US advisor in Vietnam suggesting what people do. He's giving the orders. And he was very good at what he did. It's going to be impossible to deal with World War I. I don't want to do that. There are many movies that you've seen, may have heard about it. I'd like to deal with two striking items that have gone down in our historical memory. One is the invasion of Gallipoli, and the second is the fate of the Armenians. We have getting to Gallipoli, we have Enver Pasha, who's what he calls himself, the Vice Generalissimo. He is audacious, he is cunning, and he's incompetent. So, for example, he says in the middle of the winter, we're going to take this Turkish army from here, march over these mountains, and take over parts of Russia. And then we'll go to Afghanistan and India. So in the middle of the winter, without any winter supplies really, they march off to a place where the nearest railroad is 600 miles away. You saw those carts in the mud. Every bullet, every shell had to be transported by camel. And can you imagine 86,000 men out of 100,000 were lost. It sounds like Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1814-15. So it was a terrible experience for the Turks. And Enver Pasha came back and was able to hide this. They did not publicize it. When he comes back, Cemal Pasha is an honorific title. So you have these three guys. Cemal Pasha says, let's attack the Suez Canal. So they get to the canal and they have these pontoons and they don't know how to use them. They have thousands of men killed. I mean, they're slaughtering people. We read about the British and the French let their people be slaughtered. The Turks were involved in the same kind of thing. It's horrible. Well, now we get to Gallipoli. What is the importance of Gallipoli? Here is Istanbul. Here's the Black Sea. Up here is Russia. Here's the Aegean and the Mediterranean down here. And here's Turkey. If you want to go from Russia to the Mediterranean, you have to go through here. And then, whoops, I didn't want to do that. You have to go through here and then down this long strait. And this is the Gallipoli Peninsula. And this is where the mainly British, some French forces attempted to land. Now, Winston Churchill has taken the blame for being so overly optimistic and poorly prepared that the British Navy screwed up. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty. He does have to share some of the blame, but there are other problems in the British system. There's this guy, Lord Kitchener, who's considered the great war hero, who was, from what we read, is as incompetent as everyone else. And he backs this landing in Gallipoli. If we look at this other map down here on the left, you see you have the French, the British, and the Anzac forces. The Anzacs are the Australians and New Zealanders. It's become a major item for the Australians and New Zealanders. You know, there's still this loyalty of the empire. It's hard for me, or maybe for modern people, to understand this notion of rallying to the colors. Because the British are fighting the French, the Australians and the New Zealanders need to volunteer to defend the homeland. And the British decide to send them here to Gallipoli, to these are the Dardanelles to get through here, you know, and this is how they would get at Russia. And first they want to knock the Turks out of the war. So here are the landings. You have the Turkish defense. We have Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later known as Ataturk. And this is this infamous order, or famous order. I don't order you to fight. I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places. And you know what? He was successful. There was a timing issue. Some of the Anzac landers landed in the wrong place. They didn't have orders. It was very dicey. But what happened is, in February 1915, they attacked, and they were stuck on the beaches. There was an Australian movie, Gallipoli. There are other movies, you can see this. A very difficult situation for the soldiers who were there. You have, as I say, naval attack in February, amphibious landing in April. And who's fighting? Well, you know, they don't look like Europeans. This is where the British Empire draws its soldiers, in this case from India. Those turbans suggest to me they're Sikhs. I'm not sure. I think that's they are here. But anyway, they're in the trenches, 1915. In 1916, they finally give it up. They've lost tens of thousands of men. And here is a picture of this evacuation going back to Europe. Meanwhile, there's all this fighting going on in Western Europe. The British and the French and the Germans are slaughtering each other because they have such outmoded ways of fighting. Essentially, none of these generals take account of the use of the machine gun against themselves. And so you have these human wave attacks. You know, if you have a huge number of people and you have rifles firing them, you may succeed. They get cut down both on the Western Front and in Gallipoli. It's such a waste of humans, the kind of stuff that went on. And then I want to say something about the Anzac forces. Lest we forget, this is a national day of commemoration to this day in Australia and New Zealand. It's they remember their veterans. When I was a kid, we used to, on November 11th, we used to stop classes. They would, I don't know if you had, some of you may have had that. They would ring the bell. You would stand up for the Armistice Day of November 11th, 1918. Well, that's long gone, although it's probably still a federal holiday. But Anzac Day is still alive in the memory. And here you have the flag flying. And here's a memorial at Anzac Cove, where Ataturk who becomes the dictator or president, whatever you want to call him, of Turkey in the late 1920s. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now living in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. This is Ataturk in 1934. You know, it's a very gracious speech. I'm not sure how much impact it had, but this was an attempt to end old sorrows. So this is the infamous Gallipoli, and I mention it here because this is so important for the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire falls, but this is the first attempt by people on the outside to overcome it. And we'll see that there were other invasions of the West. I want to switch here to Armenia. As I said, I can't, and I don't want to cover the details of World War I. I don't know that you're interested in that. But there's some things that stand out in historical memory. And I assume most of you are aware that something has happened with the Armenians. Some of you may know more detail than others. You know, here in Philadelphia, it's amazing. If you go down to the Art Museum and you turn onto the entry road, there's a big statue there. You generally don't stop for it because you're driving. The patron saint of Armenia graces the Philadelphia Museum. That is, there was this consciousness here, even here. Well, the Armenians lived in Eastern Anatolia. We used to call that, or maybe we still do, Asia Minor. Asia Minor, Turkey, some of the Caucasus. But it's not as though this country was filled with Turks or only Turks. You have many, many Armenians all through here. You have, and we'll see this again later, you have lots of Greeks living here and Greeks living here on the northern shore. And we'll, in the next lecture, we'll talk about what happens, another tragic story. There's so many tragic stories. But anyway, here's the Armenians. Before the war, there's a conflict between the Christian Armenians and the Muslim Kurds. And it's not just that one is a good guy and one is a bad guy. They have different interests and they raid each other and they have mutual recriminations. Here is the Armenian church. I'm not sure whether it's Georgia or Armenia that claims to be the first national church, Christian church, but here's an example. Armenian priests, they are very important in Armenian culture at this time. But Armenia, by the 15th and 16th century, had been integrated into the Ottoman Empire. And if you remember just a few minutes ago, I mentioned the millet system. Millet system allows each of these communities to have a kind of internal self-rule. All they have to do is raise enough taxes and they pay the government and then they control themselves. So they are integrated. The Armenians are in the Ottoman system, and the Armenians have a commercial tradition, both in Constantinople and elsewhere, and you get these prejudices against them, just as you get prejudices, say, against the Jewish merchants in other parts of Europe. Here, it's Armenians who are the subject of anger, and because you have to deal with them. They're very important in commerce. They didn't live, there was no Armenia. I mean, there were villages that were Armenian, and then there were villages that were Kurdish, and there are villages that are Turkish. And so you have some interaction, but they're separate lives. The Armenians somehow get in trouble because the Muslims try to use their courts. And, if you have a conflict between Muslims and Armenians, between Kurds and Armenians, whose court do you go to? Well, it's a problem. And in addition, there are Kurdish nomads who are involved in depredations against the Armenians. At the beginning of the 20th century, we have about 2.5 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, plus many abroad, mainly in Russia. See where it says Armenia. This is where modern day Armenia is. And there were, of course, people move across the borders. There was, and it's not as though the Armenians were oppressed all the time. There was an Armenian elite in Ottoman society. And you get this image of a foreign element. In the 1880s and 90s, we begin to get the emergence of an Armenian nationalism, mainly in Russia, whereas the Anatolian Armenians, in the main, we think, remain loyal to the Ottomans. But we have pogroms. I wrote programs. It's pogroms against Armenians, 1894, 1895, 1909. I mean, there are some estimates of over 100,000 people were killed. This is orchestrated by the government of the Sultan to relieve pressure to promote national feeling among the Turks, and that's even before the 1908 revolution and before the horrible things that happened in World War I. Here's the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who in and out of office, and a very humbling picture of refugees, 1897. There may have been an Armenian elite, but there are large numbers of poor Armenians. The Young Turks, remember 1908? They're really suspicious of non-Turks. This is a characteristic of nationalism as it develops in the 19th and 20th centuries. If you're not Turkish, you can't be a member of the citizenry. If you're in Poland and you're Jewish, you can't be a member of the citizenry. If you're in Serbia and you're a Muslim, we question your loyalty. Well, the Turks were doing this. But in 1914, they live along the front lines here, and the Assyrians, Assyrians are Christians. I used to think that there were no such things as Assyrians before they went out of style in the 8th century BC, but they're still around. You have these Armenians and Assyrians along the front on the European side, and the Young Turks want the Russian Armenians to fight for them. And you get Armenian troops on both sides, and they both are involved in massacres. Once again, it's not as though there's some good guys and some bad guys. They're both on both sides. This is an image of 1909 attacks on Christians, meaning Armenians. And here you can see how the stereotype clothing of the Muslims and this poor victims, massacres of Christians in Turkey. So that's again before the First World War. And you get refugees on the road. You don't even have horses, you have oxen. Well, now we have the charge of genocide against the Turks. The Young Turks blame their defeats. This is before, they're being defeated everywhere except Gallipoli, on the Armenians. They then demobilized Armenian soldiers and put them in labor battalions, and there are systematic murders. We're going to see that in a second. There are irregular forces like Kurdish nomads or others near the Russian border. And if you resist what the Turks are doing, that shows you're a traitor. Image from an Armenian village, 1915. Because in 1915, deportations of the Armenians began. They were seen as a threat to national security, and they were pushed by a forced march through eastern Anatolia towards Syria. And it's a systematic campaign of mass murder by irregular forces and by local Kurds. And when they get to Syria, there's no relief either. There are estimates of up to 1 million people murdered. In 1933, we got a book called 40 Days of Musadag by the German author Franz Werfel, and he is seen as publicizing to the world what happened. Now, Musadag was a mountain, and what happened there is a true historical event. Werfel made a novel out of it, but it's made an enormous impression. We're going to watch just a few minutes of this movie. It's on YouTube, and I'm not sure if when you if people watch this recording, you're going to get that YouTube. But here is we'll do just 2-3 minutes of this. We'll start over here because I give this background.
By the year 287 AD, the Armenians became the first Christian nation in the world, with Ashken, the first Christian queen in history. The church Echmiadzin was built in 301 AD and has been the scene of Armenian religious life for 1,600 years. In 451 AD, General Vakhtang Manikonyan was already fighting for religious freedom, but in the 13th century, the Ottoman Turks invaded and occupied Armenia, and finally in 1915, they marched 1.5 million Armenians into the Syrian desert to be exterminated. But a handful of stubborn Armenians from the time of Musadah stood their ground to resist the Turkish army. They rose from the blood and thunder of battle to create what the world has come to know as the 40 Days of Musadah.
Now, this is a movie, but from what we can tell, it's based on true events. Well, it's a horror story. We don't need to watch horror stories, but that's the image. Now, there was a German missionary group and the American ambassador who tried to stop it. They didn't succeed, but I will just show you, again, this is a short interview with the American ambassador, Mr. Morgenthau, that seems to be what we think is based on historical fact.
Your accusations are outrageous, and you're meddling in the internal affairs of our country. This Armenian situation is a simple matter of relocation for their safety until the war is over. There has been absolutely no undue harshness. No undue harshness.
This just fell into our hands. It is dated 4 months ago. To all military leaders and governors, in the event that we must forge a new alliance with our Turkish brothers to the east, the Armenians and their country will stand in our way. That problem must be eliminated. Therefore, the deportation of the entire Armenian population is justified, and all resistance must be punished by death. Signed, Alma Bey, Minister of War, Talat Pasha, Minister of the Interior.
Where did you find this?
What difference does it make?
Come, Mr. Morgenthau. An intelligent man like you falling for such fakery.
What about this? Fakery? This mass grave was dug up by German and American missionaries. These fakeries were taken by German officers assigned to your army units. My God, we've even had reports that your troops fornicating with corpses.
Lies! Fabrications! You should check your sources more carefully, Mr. Ambassador. I don't understand your concern, Mr. Morgenthau. You're a Jew. These Armenians are Christians. We've treated the Jews perfectly well. Why are you bothering with them?
I am not here as a Jew, sir. I am here as the American ambassador.
I don't like to watch horror stories too much, but that's really...
My country is out.
It's a terrible story. And here is, it wasn't even that well known until Werfel published his novel. As he says, this is Franz Werfel, the author, this book was conceived in March of the year 1929 during the course of a stay in Damascus. The miserable sight of maimed and famished-looking refugee children working in a carpet factory gave me the final impulse to snatch the incomprehensible destiny of the Armenian people from the hell of all that had taken place. The writing of the book followed between July 1932 and March 1933. Meanwhile, in November, on a lecture tour through German cities, the author selected Chapter 5 of Book 1 for public readings. It was read in its present form based on the historic records of a conversation between Enver Pasha and Pastor Johannes Lepsius. Lepsius was a missionary who was also trying to save the Armenians. And on the right side, we see a memorial by a Armenian sculptor in Vienna. In gratitude and respect, the Armenian people. You know, the Armenians, like certain other groups, have very strong historical memories. Well, the results of this, the Turks in one sense got what they wanted. They moved very much closer to a homogeneous nation state. This map showing where Musadag is, it's right on the coast here. I should fill in. What happened in Musadag is that the people of the village of Musa went up to the mountain rather than face deportation. And they, for 40 days, they held out against various Turkish forces. A number were killed, and then quite a few were rescued by the French Navy here. That movie is available on YouTube if you want to watch it. You know, it's not a happy movie. But at any rate, with the Armenians gone, you have all these Muslim refugees who themselves are refugees, get these deserted homes and property. And where there are survivors, we have records of a forced conversion to Islam. Since then, and I assume many of you know this, Turkey has consistently refused to recognize the events as a genocide. It maintains that the Armenians were a rebellious element to be pacified, and they claim the killings were not initiated or directed by the government. And Adolf Hitler, who remembers the Armenians? That's a quote given to him. In 2019, the US Congress, whereas the United States has a proud history of recognizing and condemning the Armenian genocide, the killing of 1.5 Armenians by the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923, and providing relief to the survivors of the campaign of genocide against Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Arameans, Maronites, and other Christians, resolved that is the sense of the House of Representatives, that is the policy of the United States to commemorate the Armenian genocide through official recognition and remembrance, reject efforts to enlist, engage, or otherwise associate the United States government with denial of the Armenian genocide or any other genocide, and 3, to encourage education and public understanding of the facts of the genocide, the Armenian genocide, including the US role in the humanitarian relief effort and the relevance of the Armenian genocide to modern day crimes against humanity. As you know, probably know, the Turkish government has been fighting this kind of resolution for quite some time. And it did, interesting that it passed in the US Congress in 2019. And as we're all aware, there are continuing issues between US and Turkey. The Armenians, the ones who are left, wanted revenge. And this is interesting that I found this out just as I was preparing this class, of the number of people whom they assassinated after the war. Prime Minister of Azerbaijan, Minister of the Interior, I'm not sure who Behdurhan Javansir was, Said Halim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, Behadin Shakir, founding member of the Young Turks, CUP, Young Turks. Kemal Zami, an administrator of a Trebizond vilayet is sort of a province. 22, assassination of the governor of Syria. And this is, again, the Armenians have been very good with their publicity, and the Turks have not been such good counter publicity. And here is this thing of, quote, the arch murderers, the 3 guys. We saw 2 of them in that movie. In Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, here is an Assyrian genocide memorial. Well, to finish this off in the last few minutes, Armenia becomes part of the Soviet Union after the, 1922, a founding member of the Soviet Union. You know, it's considered one of the constituent Soviet socialist republics. It's controlled by Armenian Bolsheviks, dictated by orders from Moscow. But here it is. Here's Turkey currently, Armenia today, and Georgia to the north of it, and Russia's up here. What's interesting is that just because you were a martyr in the past doesn't mean you're a good guy in the present. So Armenia has claimed this area, Nagorno-Karabakh, and they held on to it from 1991, when Armenia becomes independent, to 2020. We just had an invasion of the Nagorno-Karabakh by Azeri forces, and they drove out the Armenians. And you have these images of the Armenians there who had grabbed these places earlier after the First World War. Now they're being driven out. They burned the farms. They burned everything so that when the Azeris came, they couldn't have anything. But now this is ostensibly a part of Azerbaijan. We don't know that this is the end of what's going on there, But as I promised last week, I would like to make some reference to what happens after the First World War, bring us up to the present. And that's really present. We're talking about Turkish arms to the Azeris to conquer Nagorno-Karabakh. In World War II, there were plenty of Armenian soldiers, but there were no battles down there. And then, as I say, 1991, the modern Republic of Armenia, we have Nagorno-Karabakh and the war with Azerbaijan. I'm going to play about a minute of this, just to watch the words for the Armenian national anthem. Of course, there are more verses, but free, independent Armenia, that's the notion. And I'd like to, one more slide, contrast this, watch the words on this. Turkish national anthem. I'm sorry. Turkish national anthem. For freedom is the absolute right of this God-worshiping nation. Sort of the image of Turkey. I want to throw this in because it's, even though horrible things happen to the Armenians, it's not as though the Turks are the devils in uniform. Bad things happened under the Turks. And unfortunately, after 1992, bad things happened under the Armenians. But that's my last slide. I did not leave time for questions because I started late, and I apologize for that. But am I coming up on your screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes. We can have comments or questions, not that we have, 5-10 minutes. If people have something to add, please unmute yourself or raise your hand, or however you want to do it.
We have a question in classroom 2.
I just had a comment that there's a book by a man named Peter Balakian who lost family in Armenia.
Hold on just a minute, because I'm going to have to repeat that.
Okay.
The comment, there's a book by Peter Balakian who lost family in Armenia.
Yes.
It was very clear. We could hear it very well.
Oh, okay, keep going.
Okay, and the book is called Black Dog of Fate by Peter Balakian, and it's just a very interesting memoir. He grew up in the States, and his family simply did not talk about the war at all. So this is his growing knowledge, and I think Balakian was influential enough to, there was some kind of decision in the 2020 or something.
2019, the congressional
Right,
resolution.
and I think Balakian was very active in
Mm.
pushing for that. So it's an interesting book,
Okay,
and I would recommend it, Black Velvet Fate.
thank you.
I would only add that the Armenians lost the World War I. What they won is the propaganda war. That is to say, I'm not saying this is not an interesting book, but the Armenians have put out the books to convince us of their side of the story, which is a very compelling story. And the Turks have not been as successful as, maybe they don't have that much to defend, but anyway, that's where they are. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would add that there's an active Armenian community in Philadelphia and a church right across Ridge Avenue from us.
Across the street on Ridge Avenue. And there's another, but I think there are 2 or 3 Armenian churches in this area, one in Wynwood and one
Yes.
here. Maybe there's another one.
Here's another comment from classroom 2.
About 15 years ago, when we were in Turkey, our guide, and it was a very small group of us, our guide somewhere near Istanbul took us to an area where he pointed, we were to a village that had been an Armenian village, and none of the houses had slates, roofs, and he explained that the slate was very precious, and people, when they were evacuated, took their roofs with them
Oh, wow.
if they could
Wow.
take the slate. So that was my first knowledge of the Armenian treatment.
Right.
It may well be that they may have been Armenians, they may well have been Greeks.
Larry,
Yeah, Eileen and then Paul.
in my younger years, I married into an Armenian family, and I recall the eldest brother who would talk about their experience during the expulsion, describing how they stole food from farms, from carts to stay alive, and how his youngest brother, who was less than 2 years old, kept saying, I'm hungry. And tears were rolling down his cheeks when he was relating this, because the baby died. And when they arrived in Syria, the mother, I don't know what happened to the father, were so destitute, she couldn't care for her children. So she left them at a Syrian missionary who was helping the Armenian refugees. And it likely was the same mission where Irma Blum's parents were working with the Armenian refugees. And it was a Protestant mission, and the family became Protestant. There was a small Armenian Protestant church in New York City they went to.
Paul?
There is a very powerful anti-war song about the Battle of Gallipoli, and I would recommend it. It's a wonderful song. It's the perspective of an Australian soldier who is sent to fight at Gallipoli, and it's called, and the band played Waltzing Matilda.
Oh.
And played Waltzing Matilda. It's written by Eric Bogle, a Scotsman who lives in Australia. I recommend it. It's an excellent song. It's been very popular in song circles, and you can probably find it on YouTube.
Yeah, well, I'm going to certainly search it on YouTube after this session. Anyone else? Oh, yes. So go ahead, David.
David, did the Russian Orthodox Church help the Armenians at all?
No, first of all, the Russian Orthodox Church became a tool of Russian nationalism, and they're anti-Turkish. But remember that Orthodox is a funny word. You know, we lump all the Orthodox together, but there are 6 or 7 different Orthodox communities. So I don't know that there's any strong feeling of kinship between the Russian Orthodox and the Armenian Church.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Mostly.
Well, thank you for sticking with me. This is not a happy story, and unfortunately, there's a lot of unhappy stuff in this area, which is why maybe as a former historian, I got interested. I hope that this is of some enlightenment to you, and if you're interested, I'll see you next week as we talk about the post-war settlement and all the conflicts that have come out of that one. So
Thank you. Thank you, Larry.